So we have now looked at the central arguments of the Transcendental Aesthetic, and we have seen why Kant believes that space is an a priori intuition and why it is transcendentally ideal. And as I've already indicated, I'm not going to talk specifically about time because the arguments that Kant gives there roughly mirror those that he gives about space. But what I do want to do before we move on to the transcendental logic is I want to look at paragraph 8, general remarks on the transcendental aesthetic, which is already there in the first edition, though it is enlarged in the second B edition. And these general remarks are about several things that Kant thinks are interesting or have something to do with what he's doing in the transcendental aesthetic, and some of them are definitely worth talking about. So let's take a look at what is going on here. So under number 1, and these Roman numbers are added in the second edition, in the B edition, because, well, mostly because Kant enlarges the general remarks, and so he doesn't only have a 1, but also a 2 and a 3, and so on. So in 1, Kant is basically going to draw a distinction between his own way of thinking about sensation and concepts, so his own way of thinking about that, and the Leibnizian way of thinking about that, or as he is going to call it at some point, the Leibnizian Wolffian way of thinking about it. And so if you study Kant a bit more, this name Wolff, Christian Wolff, is going to come up a lot. Like he's not one of the major thinkers of the 17th and 18th century of early modern philosophy, but he was very influential in Germany in Kant's time. He sort of popularized, worked out the philosophy of Leibniz, published lots of textbooks and other writings that were disseminated, that were used widely in the German-speaking world. And so when Kant thinks of anything like a sort of official university philosophy or something like that, what he's thinking of is the Leibnizian Wolffian system, the Leibnizian Wolffian philosophy. When I say official, I'm not saying that all the philosophers are sort of, just following this philosophy, they're not doing anything else, or they sort of feel forced to do that. That's not really the case at all. But it's very influential. It's sort of the basics of how people do philosophy, how they think about philosophy in the German-speaking world. Okay, so what do Leibniz and Wolff say about this distinction between, on the one hand, concepts and on the other hand, sensibility? Well, we can read this at B60A43, where Kant writes the following. He says that our entire sensibility is nothing but the confused representation of things, which contains solely that which pertains to them in themselves, but only under a heap of marks and partial representations that we can never consciously separate from one another, is therefore a falsification of the concept of sensibility and of appearance, that renders the entire theory of them useless and empty. So here is what the Leibnizian Wolffian philosophy is suggesting. It is suggesting that there is no distinction of kind, in a sense, between a conceptual grasp of something and a sensible grasp of something. It's just that sensation is confused. In sensation, all these conceptual elements sort of run together. We are not able to separate them. There's something vague and confused about it. And that is what makes it sensation, this vagueness or confusedness. And so what Kant is going to do here is he is going to use the concept of a right, like something being right. He's going to use that to show that this must be a mistake. Because he points out, the concept of right, let's say the morally right thing to do, everyone has a grasp of that. But of course, only the moral philosopher has a clear grasp of it, right? Only the moral philosopher has thought through exactly how this concept works, what its constituents are, and so on and so forth. So there is a confused everyday version of right, and there is this cleared up version that we might find in moral philosophy. And Kant says, well, but that doesn't mean that this confused version somehow belongs to sensibility. I mean, the morally right, that is just not it has nothing to do with sensibility, right? One cannot say that the common concept is sensible and contains a mere appearance, for right cannot appear at all. Rather, its concept lies in the understanding and represents a constitution, the moral constitution, of actions that pertains to them in themselves. So, what Kant is claiming is that this Leibnizian Wolffian way of drawing the distinction between concepts and intuitions, in Kant's terminology, between sensibility and thought, doesn't work, right? That it doesn't work. And of course he wants to say that because if the Leibnizian Wolffian way of thinking about sensibility is right, then really the entire Transcendental Aesthetic is nonsense, right? If sensibility is only confused thought, then Kant's basic approach, his basic distinction between an intuition and a concept doesn't make any sense. But so Kant has tried to tell us here that no, right, we should reject this Leibnizian Wolffian way. In fact, he says that there's a confusion here. What have they confused? Well, this. The Leibnizian Wolffian philosophy has therefore directed all investigations of the nature and origin of our cognitions to an entirely unjust point of view, in considering the distinction between sensibility and the intellectual as merely logical, since it is obviously transcendental, and does not concern merely the form of distinctness or indistinctness, but its origin and content. Right, so it's not logical, it's transcendental. What does Kant mean with that? Well, this distinction between sensibility and the intellectual is not logical in the sense of, just being about how well worked out it is, like how much analysis we have performed, right? That we get from the sensible to the intellectual by doing more analysis, by prying our concepts apart more carefully. That would be a purely logical exercise. The difference between sensibility and the intellectual is that they're different sources of cognition, right? They're different sources that we need in order to cognize the world. And of course, thinking about the sources of our cognition is precisely the task of transcendental philosophy. And so that's why Kant says that this distinction is transcendental. It requires a different kind of philosophical effort from the one that Leibniz and Wolff think it requires. All right. Kant then goes on at A45 here to tell us a little bit more about the distinction between appearance and thing in itself. Right? And basically what Kant is going to tell us is that there is a common sense, let's say an empirical way of using this distinction, which we should not confuse with the transcendental way of using this distinction. So in common life, we can talk about mere appearances and things in themselves. Right? And Kant's example here is a rainbow. Right? If I see a rainbow, I'm like, whoa, there's a rainbow over there. And somebody might say, yes, but it's not really a thing in itself. It's only an appearance. That's not really an object. The rainbow, right? This is just the way that the rain appears to us at this moment, right? So the rainbow is a mere appearance, and it's the rain and the sunlight maybe that are the things in themselves. And Kant says that's fine. That's a perfectly okay use of those words in this empirical context. But we have to be careful that when we do transcendental philosophy, and when in transcendental philosophy we are using those terms, then we are using them with a very different meaning. Right? Because then when we talk about appearance, we talk about things as they appear to us, that is, thought under our conditions of sensibility. And of course that means that the drops of rain are just as much appearance in that transcendental sense as the rainbow, I guess. Like all the spatiotemporal objects are appearances in the transcendental sense, right? And a thing in itself, in the transcendental sense, is not like the real thing out there in the world. The thing in itself, in the transcendental sense, is the thing considered apart from our conditions of sensibility, right? And so Kant is asking us to be really careful when applying this terminology. And he is right, I think, to emphasize this, because this appearance talk sounds very close to illusion talk, right? And this leads to a lot of trouble in the interpretation of Kant, right? Where if Kant says these things are like my Nietzsche bust is a mere appearance, that sounds like he's saying it's not really there, right? It's only an illusion. It's like a rainbow or a fata morgana or whatever, and that is not what he means, right? When he says it's a mere appearance, he is taking up a position in transcendental philosophy and using the term appearance in a very specific technical sense. Okay, so Kant then, spent some more time talking about how space and time can be the basis of synthetic a priori knowledge, especially in mathematics. We are going to see that they are, in a sense, also the source of synthetic a priori knowledge in metaphysics, right? So the metaphysical knowledge that we are after is not maybe purely spatio-temporal, but space and time are going to play important roles in that, and we're gonna talk about that later on. Okay, so that brings us to the extension in the B version and to Roman number 2. And in Roman number 2, Kant seems to give a completely new, and according to some commentators, very important argument in favor of transcendental idealism, or in favor of the transcendental ideality of space. And I can't go into it in too much detail, but I do want to sort of spell out what is this argument approximately is, right? So let's read what is going on here. So, for confirmation of this theory of the ideality of outer as well as inner sense, thus of all objects of the senses as mere appearances, this command is especially useful. That everything in our cognition that belongs to intuition contains nothing but mere relations of places in one intuition, alteration of places, and laws in accordance with which this alteration is determined. But what is present in the place, or what it produces in the thing themselves besides the alteration of place, is not given through these relations. Now, through mere relations, no thing in itself is cognized. It is therefore right to judge that since nothing is given to us through outer sense, except mere representations of relation, outer sense can also contain in its representation only the relation of an object to the subject, and not that which is internal to the object in itself. Okay, what is Kant doing here? Well, he's making a distinction between relations and internal properties. This is in fact a distinction that is still common in contemporary philosophy, where we might say something like this, right? Suppose that we have this Nietzsche bust. It has the external relation of being really close to my head, right? That's not something about this Nietzsche bust in itself, it's about its relation to me. It also has some internal properties, right? It's heavy, for instance. It has mass. It is made of, gypsum, I guess. Not even sure whether that's the right English word for it. Maybe it has the internal property of being painted black, though maybe we have to understand black as some relation to the human visual sense. So that might either be an internal property or an external relation, and so on and so forth. And now what Kant seems to be suggesting is that when we think about space and how things are given to us in outer sense, in space, they are given to us as relations. But in order to cognize, in order to grasp a thing in itself, we would have to grasp its internal properties, right? The way that it is in itself, apart from its relations. So what Kant seems to be saying is that if you think about space, right, really all that space is relations, right? It's distances and things like that. It's always about being related. I mean, 2 points of space are the points of space that they are because they are related to all the other points in a certain way. Right? Something like that seems to be Kant's understanding here. The pure intuitions of space and time are purely relational. There's no intrinsic properties of the points of space or the points of time. There's only the relational properties. But that means that the way that things are given to us in space and time are merely relational ways of being given to us. And that means that they can never show us anything about the internal properties of things. And surely if we want to understand things in themselves, as they are in themselves, we would have to grasp those internal properties which are never exhibited to us in intuition. And so it is clear that spatio-temporal objects can't be the things in themselves. As I just put this argument, I guess there are lots of questions to be asked. Right? How do we know that things in themselves have internal properties? How can we be sure that those can't be exhibited in intuition, and so on and so forth? I'm not going to do an entire video about that. I also, to be frank, haven't delved into the literature. I know there is, I think, a pretty sizable literature on this. If I am not mistaken, the well-known Kant scholar Rae Langton has made passages like these about external relations and internal properties like a keystone of her interpretation of Kant's Transcendental Idealism. So if this interests you, that might be one way to search for further literature, right? To look at the ideas of Rae Langton or people writing about her interpretation of Transcendental Idealism. Okay, that's what I want to say about that. Actually, Kant has an interesting further extension of this, where he starts talking about inner sense and time, and then especially the self. And he tells us that, well, everything that is represented, and this is at B68, everything that is represented through a sense is to that extent always appearance. And an inner sense must therefore either not be admitted at all, or else the subject, which is the object of this sense, can only be represented by its means as appearance, not as it would judge of itself if its intuition were mere self-activity, that is, intellectual. And later on, at the very end of Roman number 2, Kant says, there it then intuits itself not as it would immediately self-actively represent itself, but in accordance with the way in which it is affected from within, consequently as it appears to itself, not as it is. And here we see, I think for the first time, what is going to be Kant's theory of the subject, Kant's theory of the self. And Kant is going to say that through our inner sense, which uses merely the form of time, right? I'm aware of what's happening in me. Well, that too, Kant says, is not, as maybe Descartes thought, right? Descartes maybe thought that the self was transparent to itself, that we had immediate and perfect knowledge of our own constitution as mind, as consciousness. We immediately know what we are as consciousness. But Kant thinks that, well, you know, the grasp that we have of the self, at least in intuition, right, as we sort of experience ourselves, well, we experience ourselves as appearance, right? We experience ourselves, that is, under the conditions of our own sensibility, right? We experience ourselves as temporal because that is the way that our inner sense, indeed all our sense, works. And that means that we experience ourselves as appearance again, and not as a thing in itself. Our own experience of ourselves too stands under these conditions of sensibility, just like our awareness of spatiotemporal objects. Except that in the case of the self, space doesn't play a role, and it's only time that plays a role. But the underlying philosophical point remains the same. And so Kant does not think that we have an immediate grasp of what we are in ourselves, like apart from the way that we affect ourselves, that we appear to ourselves. And that is actually going to be very, very important later on. Okay, so that is Roman number 2, where Kant talks about external relations, internal properties, and then ends up prefiguring, at the very least, his kind of, I don't know whether it's skeptical, but certainly transcendental idealist theory of the self or the subject. So, number 3. In number 3, Kant is going to try to put some distance between himself and a Cartesian skeptic. If I say in space and time intuition represents both outer objects as well as the self-intuition of the mind, as each affects our senses, that is, as it appears, that is not to say that these objects would be a mere illusion. Right? So Kant says, well, when I say appearance, right, I do not mean illusion. We already talked about that several times, I think, by now. But Kant wants to stress it again. Right? He is not claiming, when he says that something is an appearance, he's not claiming that it's a mere illusion. And in fact, Kant wants to have the distinction between an appearance and an illusion. Right? The rainbow might in some sense be an illusion, but the raindrops, transcendentally speaking, are an appearance. And it is not, like maybe for somebody like Berkeley, all ideas, and maybe also for somebody like Hume, all ideas are on the same footing, right? All ideas are ideas. That's their fundamental reality. They're there. And we might call some of them illusions if we can't really fit them into our model of a physical world. But there's something dubious about that, right? There's something illusory, maybe, about the notion of an illusion. I think you can, if you delve deeply into Humean skepticism, part of that skepticism is going to be the claim that there really is no distinction between a veridical and an illusory perception, right? Between a perception that shows something as it really is, and a perception that is only illusory, like a fata morgana or a, just something that your mind makes up. It's all the same kind of thing. It's equally real. Kant doesn't want that. Right, absolutely not. Kant's appearances relate to objects, and there are going to be other representations, maybe other mental states that are not appearances, that are mere illusions. So, if one ascribes objective reality to those forms of representation, then one cannot avoid thereby transforming everything into mere illusion. So here Kant is saying that it's actually the other people, the people who claim that spatiotemporal objects are things in themselves, that they have that space and time have objective reality, that is, that they are transcendentally real rather than transcendentally ideal. Those are the people that cannot avoid transforming everything into mere illusion. Maybe in the way that I just indicated, that for somebody like Hume it's going to be really hard to make a distinction between a veridical perception and an illusion. But here's the way that Kant himself is going to give the argument. He says, for if one regards space and time as properties, that as far as their possibility is concerned, must be encountered in things in themselves, and reflects on the absurdities in which one then becomes entangled. Because two infinite things that are neither substances, nor anything really inhering in substances, must nevertheless be something existing, indeed a necessary condition of the existence of all things, which also remain even if all things are removed, then one cannot well blame the good Berkeley if he demotes bodies to mere illusion. Okay, so what Kant is saying is that space and time, when you think of them as transcendentally real, are gonna turn out to be absurd. Right? They're not really things, but they're also not really not things, and they're not really independent of the objects, but they also can't be dependent of the objects, and you get into all kinds of trouble. And so he says, if this is where you start, then Berkeley seems to make sense. right? Berkeley, who claimed that all matter is an illusion, that in a sense there is no physical world. That makes sense. Everything becomes just in the mind. There is no space and time. That becomes the only thing you can really say. And now Kant says, well, remember what I just said about time and inner sense. What holds for outer sense here must hold for inner sense as well. And so, indeed, even our own existence, which would be made dependent in such a way on the self-subsisting reality of a non-entity such as time, would be transformed along with this into mere illusion, an absurdity of which no one has yet allowed himself to be guilty. Right? Really, Kant seems to say, if you are a transcendental realist, you're bound to end up having to say that we ourselves are only an illusion. And of course, these people don't really say that. That is an absurdity of which no one has yet allowed himself to be guilty. Well, I guess Kant isn't really thinking about Buddhists, like Zen Buddhism and so on. An absurdity of which no one has yet allowed himself to be guilty. Like, this is a conclusion, Kant suggests, that sort of logically follows from transcendental realism. But of course it's a conclusion that nobody wants to draw, and so people haven't drawn it. But if you think it through, this is where transcendental realism is going to lead you. It's going to lead you to a skepticism, first about the external world, and then about yourself. And that's not, presumably, where we want to end up. Actually, maybe Hume comes kind of close in the treatise, when he says that the self is merely a bundle of sensations. Anyway, Kant didn't know the treatise. So when Kant talks about Hume, so Hume's theoretical books, there's the treatise and there's the inquiry. Kant probably only knew the inquiry. He almost certainly at least didn't know most of the treatise. Alright, number 4. I'm not going to say so much about that. In number 4, Kant is going to apply the things that he's been saying in the aesthetic to theology. And he says, look, if space and time are the conditions of things in themselves, well, one of the things in themselves is surely supposed to be God. So then we have to say that God is spatiotemporal. But that doesn't make any sense. And so, again, I mean, theology doesn't fit transcendental realism very well, and it fits transcendental idealism very well. So that's another nice thing. I don't know how strong that argument is. I don't really have an opinion about that. I mean, God is such a weird metaphysical entity, right? So different from everything else, that it sounds kind of possible to always make an exception for God, right? I mean, if you... It seems to me at first sight that you would have to be a rather untalented metaphysician if you were unable to make some special exception for God, right? To think of some argument that says, oh, but God has this and this very special property, which means that he doesn't fall under space and time. Anyway, I mean, Kant certainly thinks that might be special pleading, and I guess he is right. Well, we will leave talk of how Kant has to think about God until we get to the ideal of pure reason, which is going to be a long, long while yet, in which Kant is going to talk about, well, in which he's going to talk about God and what we can know about God, and whether there can be arguments for God, and so on and so forth. And this starts only at AE 567, so we are still more than 500 pages, I think, away from that. About 500 pages away from that. Alright, that's what I wanted to say about paragraph 8 of the Critique of Pure Reason, these general remarks added to the Transcendental Aesthetic. And that concludes for now what I have to say about the Transcendental Aesthetic. And next time we will be talking about the Transcendental Logic, when concepts are going to be playing a role, when we are going to move to the realms of the understanding and reason.